Thanks very much. I will probably not even take 10 minutes, just to make sure that the schedule is kept solid. Thanks to the organizers, I'm very happy to be here. I drove in from Pittsburgh yesterday, a 4-hour trip that took 7 hours, so I'm happy to be anywhere that's not the inside of a car. I want to speak about the Palestine-Israeli conflict. I'm going to skip the introductory sort of preamble. You all know about this conflict. I'm going to begin speaking simply about what I think is the most recent non-local, non-Middle Eastern phenomenon that has co-opted or absconded away with the momentum of the conflict. In doing this, I in no way mean to disenfranchise or remove the agency of the individual actors and communities acting in this conflict, and to say that they are sort of somehow puppets or in this very Orientalist mode, or doing these things kind of by virtue of the lack of their own agency. But rather, I'm trying to connect this conflict and its forward momentum to a broader economic and political force present in our contemporary society. So currently, this momentous force, non-local to the Middle East, holds sway in the region. This economic intellectual movement manifests itself globally, operating without a distinct infrastructure in any nation state, while at the same time incorporating the functional political and economic components of many national and international institutions. Known concisely as neoliberalism, this comprehensive power structure can be characterized by its unyielding commitment to economic deregulation, expansive corporate profit margins, the transfer of virtually all available capital in the hands of small political and economic elites, and the aggressive and irrevocable reduction of the state as a provider of services of all kinds. According to geographer David Harvey's elucidation, quote, "Neoliberalism is in the first instance a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can be best advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. The state has to guarantee, for example, the quality and integrity of money. It must also set up those military, defense, police, and legal structures and functions required to secure private property rights and to guarantee, by force if need be, the proper functioning of markets. Furthermore, if markets do not exist in areas such as land, water, education, healthcare, social security, environment, then they must be created by state action if necessary. But beyond these actions, the state should not venture." So neoliberalism instructs in that where there is war, there is market. And where there's market, then a profit can certainly be made. The public interest, civilian safety, preservation of global peace are subservient to these considerations. So tellingly, this new global reality has been acknowledged by some former architects of this design, applied recently and with devastating effect by American military forces in the Middle East. As former chief of staff to the Secretary of State under the George W. Bush administration, Colin Powell, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson testified recently, quote, "In many respects, it is now private interests that benefit most from our use of military force." So war then can no longer be said to be a state or public interest. Indeed, using 21st century neoliberal practice, Wilkerson goes on to let us know that we, quote, "we've privatized the ultimate public function, war." But the aforementioned model for military and industrial application of the neoliberal ideal is not only the only method through which this market expansion can be achieved. Like invasion and forcible conversion of previously autonomous spaces into profit-driven market creations benefiting the architects of military production and industrial reconstruction, slower, more deliberate patterns of warfare and political violence likewise suit the application of forcible privatization. So this fits perfectly with the idea of ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Taken as a case study here, we can see the multiple, multifaceted economic benefits presently being derived by non-local political and economic agents from the perpetuation of conflict between warring national groups in the region. These material benefits derive from carefully worked political designs that allow for profit-making, even where outwardly complex political machinations or international policies seem to take the fore. So I'll just briefly adumbrate what I see as 4 distinct elements of the mass market creation and privatization that is incumbent in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And again, I'll conclude just after that, and we can hopefully leave some time for discussion afterwards. The first of these, what I see as 4 distinct elements of privatization within the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that's incumbent or endemic to the neoliberal process is corporate expansion. So U.S.-based and international corporations take advantage of the contested status of the Palestinian West Bank, the internationally recognized home of the future Palestinian state, In practice today, however, the West Bank is a totally disambiguated and heavily militarized geographical space in which indigenous Palestinian communities are kept largely separate from one another by a series of Israeli-only bypass roads. A number of companies, including Motorola, SodaStream, Ahava USA, Intel, Caterpillar Inc., operate within the Palestinian territories, exploiting local markets and benefiting from low operational costs afforded to them by the Israeli government, used as incentives for non-Palestinian regional development. In fact, in the case of CAT, this is a very famous company that benefits from the policies of Israeli occupation. They, in fact, have amended one of their large D9 Caterpillar units to become a weapon. In fact, they militarized it, made it an armored piece of machinery, and mounted a machine gun on top. The Caterpillar D9 bulldozer is, in fact, what crushed and killed U.S. peace activist Rachel Corrie in Gaza in 2003. I believe it was. So this is not simply a company that's deriving, incentives or economic benefit. In fact, they're participating by being, making their products specifically designed for occupation use. This is the second category, civil policing. I think is one that's very close to many or most of us. A number of U.S. municipalities and federal law enforcement agencies have engaged in policing and training exercises with Israeli police and military units in order to improve surveillance, restriction, and control, which become vitally necessary in neoliberal states. Police forces in Atlanta, St. Louis County, Missouri, which is home to Ferguson, and Knoxville, Tennessee are among those U.S. agencies who have collaborated, cooperated, and trained with Israeli military forces. Such widespread cooperation among police and military units between two countries promotes an expansion of hyper-militarized methods of policing in the United States, while underwriting U.S. support for notoriously violent Israeli policing and crowd control in Palestinian areas. Third, and connected to that, the idea of technology and surveillance of control. In keeping with its own nascent neoliberal tradition, for instance, the Israeli state has successfully married private industry, state policy, and higher education, applying innovative methods of research and development and research institutions within the country for the use in state goals. Other neoliberal states, especially the U.S., have subsequently then benefited from military and civilian technology exchanges and purchases with Israel, retooling the products in questions and expanding military applications of a given technology in order to surpass eventually the client state in widespread use and broad application. In this relationship, then we get the idea of Israel being a regional Sparta that is on the front line and engaged in an ongoing, a rolling military conflict. And through the client state status of Israel, according to the United States policymakers, then we're benefiting from the ongoing update and design and renovation of military surveillance and control technologies. A great example of that is the drone system that is applied in the United States and has been innovated and refined and mastered to a devastating degree within Israel. Great. Finally, defense contracts, which is probably the most bloated and well-known of all the U.S.-Israeli client relation aspects. As been well documented, U.S. provisions are unparalleled in diplomatic history to the state of Israel. Fulfilling these contractual obligations requires the United States to construct and maintain the history's largest military, in fact. And policy likewise requires Israel to maintain a need for military-grade weaponry and materiel. In domestic policy, these arrangements are not labeled as federal subsidies, but in practice, military contracts and components for weapons do in fact qualify what we call in any other industry as a subsidy. In effect, the U.S. military gets to sort of maintain their massive stockpiles and refine and rehash old military equipment again with the idea of using it in Israel. I'll say in closing, the U.S. and its neoliberal allies incorporate elements of Palestinian resistance and regional state and non-state opposition into rhetorical and discursive narratives sustaining state policy within the authoritative news media. This is evident in the print and televised news strategies to identify all forms of Palestinian resistance to Israel, especially armed resistance, as terrorism, enveloped in this globally sort of encompassing war on terror. This effort includes and is part and parcel of the Palestinian narrative as well. The great lengths sustained by the authoritative media of neoliberal states in order to connect divergent and distinct groups of actors under the blanket of one antithetical coalition comprise necessary discursive strategies set into motion in order to preserve this expansive pro-military and pro-corporate policy, which is all incumbent to and endemic in neoliberalism. That's very bitty and rather partial, but hopefully if there's things to flesh out and other ideas, we can have that discussion in Q&A. Thank you very much.